listeners, it's Jana. Welcome back to Grief Out Loud. What does grief look like when death, rather than being an exception or a rarity, occurs with heartbreaking regularity? This is the question I got to explore with Nora, a sociologist, ethnographer, documentary filmmaker, and assistant professor of education at Barnard College. Nora's work looks at how youth develop and relate to their inner lives in response to gun violence, racism, and other external constraints. She's the author of the amazing book, Brothers in Grief: The Hidden Toll of Gun Violence on Black Boys and Their Schools, which grew out of the 2 years that Nora spent at a Philadelphia boys' high school learning from students whose lives had been shaped by repeated losses from gun violence. We talk about cumulative grief, the emotional lives of Black boys, what schools get right and sometimes not so right after a death, and why being deeply curious may matter much more than trying to fix someone's grief. Nora is extremely thoughtful in her work and in this conversation about the questions that were fundamental to her research. How does so much loss early on affect these youth in their relationships, their aspirations, and how they see themselves? And because it's Grief Out Loud, we also talk about Nora's personal experiences with grief. Okay, here's our conversation. Nora, welcome to Grief Out Loud.
Hi, happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
I know it took us a couple of reschedules to get to this place, thanks to the crud making the rounds in your household. So
yes, but we made it. Everyone is healthy. Knock on wood.
I know we connected really about your professional work in the realm of grief and gun violence. And as always at Grief Out Loud, we like to really ground it in the personal. So, what was your experience with grief coming into the work that you do now?
Yeah, so I think in childhood and adolescence, I had a couple losses, some significant, two of my two remaining grandparents, I lost in elementary school and a few classmates, but I don't remember any of those having like a really long-term impact for me. I don't remember the experience of grief deeply, but I think there have been sort of three big, more recent loss experiences that really shaped my interest in studying grief and informed some of the questions that I have had about grief. So the first was when I was a first year, brand new 22-year-old teacher at a high school in Chicago, right out of college. In the fall of that year, we experienced the really tragic deaths of three students on a field trip. It was a drowning incident on a school field trip. Totally unexpected, really just horrific in the widespread impact that there were other kids who were there when it happened. There were teachers who felt like they should have been there. And then obviously the entire rest of the school. And it was a pretty tight-knit, small school. So losing three students, everybody in the school at least knew well one of those young people. And I, even though I had only been at the school a couple months, really already had some connection to all three of them. I got very close with some of the students who were very close with the boys that were lost and followed their experience of grief over the year and the year after. And that raised a lot of questions for me about school, like what is the place of grief in a school and how does grief shape a young person's ideas about their own future? At the same time, I was still a young person, a pretty young person. And this happened just a couple of months after I had lost my closest friend up to that point, high school friend and a longtime crush who also died in a freak accident just the week that I was moving to Chicago to start this new job. And I really hadn't yet kind of like settled into my new life enough to really process it. So I think I was over that year making sense of peer loss, both as someone who had lost my own friend and as a kind of observer of my students who were processing their peer loss. And then I think the most personally significant loss experience for me was my mom. She was diagnosed with terminal brain cancer, glioblastoma, in 2013. And I learned about the diagnosis the same day that I learned I was accepted into a PhD program. So her 6+ year illness almost directly overlapped with my time in grad school and the sort of period of carrying out this project and honing my research questions and doing the research. And then she died in 2019, which was just when I was kind of in the thick of writing my dissertation. So those years of her illness, which kind of went through many phases, and I navigated them with my dad, who was her primary caretaker. Yeah, I think her illness and her death like brought up a lot of different kinds of grief, along the way, and then obviously after she died, that I'm still processing and figuring out and discovering new parts of that grief experience every year.
Well, it seems like, at least in your educational journey, both as an educator and in, going to PhD school, going through a PhD program, two really intense experiences, right? Like first year of teaching and then entering a PhD program. And that grief is this very close companion for both of those experiences.
Yeah, I actually hadn't thought about that it that way, but you're right. It has been the core of like the most formative kind of educational moments.
Well, speaking of, continuing to process the loss of your mom, we just went through Mother's Day because it's May here. And I wonder what that day was like for you this year, being a mom yourself and grieving your mom.
Yeah, I I mean, I feel lucky in some ways that Mother's Day was never a particularly significant holiday in my family growing up, because I think that would make it a lot harder, and obviously we're all inundated with messaging, and emails and sales and just like constant talk of Mother's Day. So it's hard not to, have it feel like a poignant and sad day. I think, yeah, being a mom and thinking about the loss of my mom, I think sort of reminds me of this like piece of grief, that it's not just about me being sad that I lost someone and sad about the like gap in my own life, but reminds me about how much loss for her, like that she was in the middle of her life. She had lots of things, still to look forward to. She would have loved to see me become a mother, find a partner, get married, things that she didn't get to see. Yeah, the sort of poignancy around Mother's Day in some ways is the reminder, that she lost out on these moments for her, for her daughter, her only daughter, and her, grandchildren. Yeah, that just feels really sad. And then obviously there's lots of things that come up in parenting that I wish I could ask her about, milestones I wish she was here for. But yeah, remembering like the loss to her is kind of a newer feeling for me.
I think that catches a lot of people off guard. And then initially, it's often grieving what we had, grieving what we won't have in the future, but then to grieve for what our person doesn't get to have, especially as we move into new life experiences and like, oh, they aren't able to experience this or witness this or be part of it in some way.
Right.
Well, now I want to just talk about your grief, but I know we're here to talk about the work that you've done in your project. So I'm going to switch over to that, but I imagine we'll come back to your grief along the way. How did you come to do this specific research project that led to your book, Brothers in Grief?
Yeah, well, that question will definitely loop us right back to my grief. In some ways, this project emerged from a slightly different question that started to come up for me in Chicago when I was a high school teacher, and when I was watching my students experience their loss. I started to become interested in things that I would hear my students say about not expecting to live very long. So these were Black students, mostly low income, mostly would-be first-generation college students. This was a college prep charter school, so it was kind of designed to be social mobility pusher. Oh, and these kids, I heard a few of them say after they lost their three friends in this freak accident, they said, "We're the good kids. We're the ones who have like made a lot of choices to avoid the known dangers in Chicago, the gun violence, the gang violence. We've opted out of that. We work really hard to avoid it, and we're still dying." I think for many of them, this kind of confirmed that they couldn't escape the possibility of early death. They would talk very openly about not expecting to live past 20 or 25, or kind of like having this idea of of an early death and a life expectancy that was short. And I became really interested in how does a young person plan their future with that in mind? How do they respond to a school that's telling them to prepare for college, to make sacrifices to go to college, to accumulate debt to go to college, like to leave their family to go to college? How do you think about those things if you also don't expect to live very long? There seems to be tensions there that I wanted to explore. And then as I got to grad school and I was starting to read the literature and think about this question and see how other people had looked at it, I was also in the midst of this kind of anticipatory grief for my mom and grappling with this prognosis that she was given of 15 months. Around the end of my first year of the PhD program, we hit this 15-month mark and nothing happened. There was no, she didn't die, but also like nobody had it marked on their calendar except me. I don't think I literally had it on my calendar, but I was very aware of that date. But no doctors acknowledged it. It's just like, yeah, that was our prognosis. Now we've passed it. There's no new prognosis. And actually, we had this very strange experience of essentially her being kicked out of hospice because she had lived too long, but her diagnosis hadn't changed, but she was sort of stable. And so the hospice services were removed and then eventually returned when it became more clear that like we were close to the end. But still, the timeline, we couldn't predict the exact timeline. And obviously these situations are very different, but they got me thinking about, what happens when we anticipate our own death or someone else's death and preemptively grieve for it and try to plan for it, or maybe we're unable to plan for it, or we prevent planning our own life because of it. I became really fascinated in that question and for myself, and then also for young people who were kind of facing this in a different way. So that's where I was in the early years of grad school and, starting to think about what a dissertation would be. And basically, I couldn't figure out how to research that question. Like my students in Chicago had said those things so readily to me, but I was trying to put myself in situations where I could meet young people in Philadelphia, and I actually just wasn't hearing it in the same way. I'm not sure what to make of that. I don't know if that was the difference in time, a difference in place, just luck. But I realized like directly researching that question wasn't as easy as I thought. And then I had a series of really good luck connections of being put in touch with the principal at the school that I call Boys Prep in the book. This was in the summer of 2016, and the school had just lost a freshman student to gun violence. And the principal is this lovely, fantastic guy who has a EDD, so he has a doctorate, he has done research, he understands research, he believes in research, and he really cares about his students. He was really interested in answering some of the other questions I had, or the related questions I had about grief and about kids, how kids were thinking about their future. So yeah, it just started to become clear that I could come to this school and be a welcomed member of the community as a researcher. The questions that I ended up answering are not exactly the ones I started with, but definitely related.
And then just briefly, what was the scope of your project then? You were there at the school for a period of time, interviewing and talking with students.
Yeah, I was there for 2 years, 2 school years, and I was there as an ethnographer. meaning that, my sort of sole job was to be a researcher, to kind of embed myself into the community, to get to know the students as well as the staff, to get to know the kind of daily routines and rituals of the school. The main method of ethnography is participant observation, so sort of being a participant and observing, and then also interviews. I also observed the students who allowed me to on their social media, which ended up being a much bigger part of the project than I anticipated. I had a kind of core group of students who were initially the close friends of the boy who died in the summer of 2016, Tahir. So his circle of friends were kind of my core from the beginning, and I would follow them around school and hang out with them in the cafeteria and go to their classes, sit in the hallway with them if they cut class. I was really lucky that the school basically gave me permission to be an adult in the building who could promise confidentiality to students, unless I felt like there was, danger. And also, I was not going to discipline them. I was not an employee of the school, and I didn't have to enforce their rules. That made me a very confusing person to the students, and I think some of the adults too, at least for a while, were unclear who I was. But I think once students, understood, or I was kind of vouched for by a peer, I think many of the students sort of came to see me as someone they could trust. And being there for a long term, coming back week after week also made a difference.
I just was picturing like 2 years of you sort of roaming the hallways with your recording devices, whatever you were using to take notes in a way. And yeah, just the progression of that and how odd it must have been for the students at the beginning. Like, who is this person
Yes.
and why does she keep asking me all these questions?
Yeah. I mean, they have models for student teacher, therapist, journalist, even. But yeah, researcher, ethnographer is not a role that they are familiar with.
Can you speak just briefly to the prevalence of peer loss and grief, particularly for Black students?
Yeah. So we actually, I mean, we don't really track like numerically the impact of loss or grief. We track losses, like, we track deaths. So, like, for example, I guess I'm thinking of gun violence in particular because that's sort of the focus of my study. So we know the number of young people that are killed every year by guns, like it's, 2 or 3,000 every year. And we know that Black youth are disproportionately represented in that number. And then there's some kind of classic research that estimates that homicide leaves behind approximately 10 grievers. But I think, you and I would probably agree that this estimate seems way off. This person who did the study, she's mostly estimating family, but even that's probably a low number. So I think common sense would tell us that many more people grieve. But also in the case of a young person, what I found both, in my life as a teacher and then in this work, the whole school is impacted, and each loss affects dozens of close friends, and networks, social networks beyond the school. To answer your question about sort of how we talk about prevalence, I think that's one way, is like that each loss is just impacting wide swaths of a community of other youth. I think the other way we can think about it, if we look at a like one community, so the school where I did my work is a school of about 400 students, pretty small. Most people know each other. I did a little kind of experiment at the end of my research. I went back through all of my notes and all of my screenshots from social media, sort of all the records I had, and I tried to document every time that I learned about a death that impacted somebody in the school. So this could have been like one student posting on social media that they had a friend who died, and maybe that was a friend, who lived in another city that nobody else knew. In other cases, it would be a death that 20 people posted about, but I kind of documented all of them on a timeline. You can see that for this community, this school community, not a month can go by that there isn't a loss within the social network of this community. A death loss, most likely a gun violence death loss. I think to me that's a very powerful way of thinking about prevalence, and also shows us that for Black male youth in particular, their experience of loss is constant.
Yeah, I mean, we think about like a school community, right? And a student dies, and you're like, okay, that's a one time thing. And maybe in 5 years, another student dies. But to think like once a month, someone in that school community is being directly impacted by the death of someone, primarily from gun violence. It's a staggering number.
And I mean, I had the experience as a student of what you described. Every couple years, and often from an accident or drug related. But yeah, this is a very different situation.
Well, it makes me think too, and this is a little bit of a side note question, but a lot of the kids and teens that I work with at Dougie Center, it's common to hear them say, I felt like the only one at my school who had had someone die, which is not numerically true. Like usually there's at least a few other students in their school who've had a parent or a sibling or someone else in their family die. But in the school that you were working in, it seems like that would be an impossibility that someone thinks like nobody else has had someone die.
Right. I think you're right. But I do also think that they're not talking about it. And I'm sure we're going to get into that piece of this. So, I have a very different view than they have. I mean, maybe on social media, they're seeing the same posts that I'm seeing, but they're not getting this sort of the full picture that I can see. And so if kids aren't talking about it with each other, then if they're the hypothetical person I mentioned earlier who lost somebody who lives somewhere else and no one else was affected, they probably don't mention it in school. It's possible that none of their friends know about it. It's possible that the social worker at school doesn't hear about it. And the only way I heard about it was an interview or their one social media post. So they could be feeling more alone in this than they are. Definitely.
And throughout the course of your research, your time at Boys Prep, you came into the project because Tahir had died a freshman. So speaking a lot with his close community. But then other deaths occurred during your research. Do you want to speak to some of those?
Yeah, so the book actually is kind of structured around a school year, which was the second school year that I was there. It follows the death of Jason. And Jason had been a part of my study the first year I was there. So he was part of the kind of extended social circle of Tahir. And I met him, through that social circle and interviewed him and spent time in some of his classes. And then the next fall, which was his senior year, he was killed in a kind of still confusing conflict with an older man at a Thanksgiving family gathering. So kind of what seems like a sort of spur of the moment conflict that became violent. And Jason died in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, outside of Philadelphia. That was Thanksgiving weekend, and then the school, we all came back to the school the Monday after Thanksgiving, and that's sort of where my book starts. So I kind of tell the story of how the school responded and how all the students experienced this kind of second big loss, over this short time at the school. It was the first time in the school's history that a current student had died during the school year. So not just during the summer, but during the school year. And then that same year in April, over Easter weekend, another student, a sophomore named Bill, was killed in Philadelphia on the street. And yeah, so I mean, it was sort of, yeah, just a horrific year for everyone, obviously. And this strange, sick luck that was the same year that I was there with these questions about grief and peer loss. Throughout that whole time, there's also other deaths that are impacting a smaller cohort in the school. But yeah, while I was there, there were these two significant current student deaths.
And you talked about the research you do as participant observation. So you are observing, but you're also a participant. And I wonder what it was like for you to continue doing that work of researching and talking with the boys and the students and the educators, while also you had a personal relationship with Jason as well. How did that unfold for you?
Yeah, that was really hard, and nobody prepared me for that, or, and I certainly didn't predict that that would happen. I felt incredibly conflicted at, many moments, and especially in those early days about what my role was. I remember this really vivid, I have this really vivid memory of a moment at the memorial service, which was at the school. The funeral was closed and private, but the school hosted a kind of larger memorial that first week or two that we were back, and I didn't know where I should sit. If I was pure researcher, ethnographer, I should go like sit right near all the kids that I was embedded with, so to speak, or that I was close with, that I was trying to understand their experience. I should go like sit with them. But my kind of social location and who I am in this space, especially with a lot of people around who didn't know me, would tell me that maybe I should go sit with the teachers, and then I thought, well, me as a person, like who do I want to be with in this moment? Like who do I want to experience my grief with? Really wasn't actually sure about the answer to that question because I had this strange place in the school, and it didn't necessarily have anyone who I would call like a friend, or but then I would like wondered, should I be back in the corner? Should I, if I want to take notes or like jot things on my phone, I don't want people to think I'm being rude, so maybe I should really like exempt myself from the space. Yeah, so I mean, to me, that moment kind of encapsulated a real confusion. I think ultimately I tried to find a balance, over the long term of, making sure that I had spaces in my own life, my therapist, my friends, my dad, where I could talk through what I was feeling. But really, when I was at the school, like trying to be an ethnographer, but also be as authentic as possible. So if I felt like I was gonna cry, I cried. Like I didn't, if I, if the kids were sharing a memory that I also remembered or had a comment on, I shared it. So I tried not to kind of censor my own emotional response, but not like lean on people there to support me. It was a really different experience researching after Jasan's death than the year before, when I was researching Tahir's friends and his life and his memory, and I hadn't known him. And I was really kind of able to, not have a personal emotional response, but also didn't know that much about him. And that was sad. And it, in some ways, like I had more to grasp onto, as sad as it was after Jasan's loss, because I did know him, and I had my own memories of him.
So, where did you end up locating yourself during this memorial service?
Yeah, well, I ended up, it was actually really crowded. And like I spent all this time fretting. And by the time I was ready to sit, there really weren't that many seats. And so I ended up in this seat between a teacher and a student who I didn't really know that well. Yeah, it was kind of an awkward seating location. And then I was obsessed with, or, like stressing about what I was writing on my phone. How can I take the least amount of notes but also make sure that I really remember these like critical moments. Yeah, I feel like it was a cop out the way I resolved it. It was just like whatever the open seat was.
Well, it reminds me of so many people describe how the lead up to a particular event in their grief, there's so much wondering and worrying and fretting, as you said, of like, how's it going to go? Whether it's the first Mother's Day or a birthday or an anniversary, then the day happens and it just unfolds the way it unfolds. And all of the lead up seems to almost be harder for folks, in a way, because there's so much to think through until it's actually happening. You write in your book, Brothers in Grief, a lot about the social restrictions on both the experience of and the expression of grief, particularly for students of color. And I'm wondering, how did the students you talked with describe that?
I don't think they separated the social restrictions around grief from all the other ways that their emotional lives are socially restricted for the most part. Like so much of the constraints around grief are wrapped up with the sort of constraints around being a boy, being a Black boy, and expressing emotion in general in that body. But they did talk a lot about crying as this like thing that holds a lot of weight. So they would sort of say, I don't cry, or I didn't cry at this particular moment, and I take pride in not crying. Or they would say, I did cry this one time, like I cried at the funeral, and it was a huge deal. Or they'd be aware of how others might view whether or not they cried. And crying would, in a particular like socially sanctioned place like a funeral, crying was something they kind of felt an obligation to do in some cases, but then any other setting, they felt like for all the kind of stereotypical obvious reasons, they felt like they shouldn't. One of the most interesting things was what I heard from a couple of like really insightful boys about recognizing that their teachers might not think they were grieving unless they named it as grief or unless they were crying. A lot of kind of loaded racial and gender race, racialized and gendered expectations there because a lot of their teachers were white women, and I think we have been trained to like express our emotions in particular ways. I'm saying we as white women. So I think the boys kind of intuitively knew that there were ways that their white women teachers expressed emotions, and that might correspond to how they expected these students to express emotion, or to express grief. Yeah, so I think, a lot of the ways that they thought about like what was allowable in terms of grief was just sort of what was allowable in general for them. And the other thing that I wasn't expecting to hear that I think is very powerful is the way that some of them talked about how much they worked to protect each other from sadness, and that some of their efforts to either not talk about their grief or to not show it in social settings with peers was that they didn't want to make their friends sad. They would say, like, I know we're all experiencing this, but if I start crying or if I start talking about being sad, then I'm just going to make other people sad. I think we can probably all relate to that in some ways, but I think it gets kind of like loaded up with these other racialized expectations on them too.
I was curious as well about, like, I think about the messaging that all of us get, right? About like how we're supposed to grieve or not grieve, or show our grief or not show our grief. And the messages that the boys that you were working with received, maybe from family members or teachers or from their community, and then the messages they shared with one another. And I wondered if you noticed if those were the same or if there was a difference, if the boys were like, I want my friends to feel safe to show their grief, but I'm not going to show mine, or
Hmm. It's a really interesting question. I don't think, I mean, I think if you ask them that question, they would say, oh, like I do want to be a safe place for my friends. I want us to be able to talk to each other and be vulnerable. And that's what they would say to me in our interviews, quite a lot, that they really longed for spaces like that. And some of them did enact it. There was a really beautiful club at the school that was called Freedom to Speak. A couple students initiated as just like a space to be together at lunch and share about their lives. I think they would say that they would want that. And then in practice, I don't actually think many of them had the tools to do that, to create those spaces, or maybe even the kind of like emotional expressive literacy. I just don't think that we give Black boys those tools and enough of those spaces, and so then to expect them to just create it for themselves and their friends, I think is a lot to expect. And, a few of them did it, of course, and the club I mentioned, but it wasn't like an abundance of that.
Well, it leads me to another question around when I think about the idea of cumulative loss, of having so many losses, and especially in what's really a short period of time. I mean, these kids are ninth, 10th, 11th, 12th graders. They're not even really 18 yet and have had so much loss. And I wonder if they talked with you at all about their expectation for themselves and how they should or shouldn't be responding. And I ask that because I think about this idea of sometimes if you've had a number of losses, you might think, I should be better at this. Like, I should know how to do this. It happens all the time. Or I've had so much loss, there's no way. Like, this is just too much. It's too overwhelming. I just wondered if they talked at all about that.
The first thing that comes to mind is the way some of the adults talked about that. And really in that first way that you mentioned, that there were adults who would say, these are Black boys growing up in Philadelphia, growing up around violence. They have faced and they will continue to face so much loss. They need to become resilient. Like, they need to be able to face this and get over it or get through it. And that was kind of the justification for some of the, what I would consider kind of tough love approach, and some of the sort of quick return to normal after a loss, and quick return to like rigorous expectations and academic expectations. So I think teachers in some cases had that attitude. I didn't hear that from students, like the sense of like I should be able to get through it. I heard more like a numbness, like I just can't feel anymore. I can't allow myself to feel anymore. I can't go to candlelight vigils anymore because it's just too hard and there's just too many. The cumulativeness was also like spatial and temporal, and there'd a memorial event for one person on the same day as a like anniversary basketball tournament for another person. Or you'd be wearing, one of the kids might be wearing a t-shirt, an RIP t-shirt for one friend, and have a tattoo of another friend on his arm. It's hard to fathom that, like you said, at such a young age, the kind of just quantity of loss.
You alluded to this a little in your last response around the progression of the school's experience, like the larger community of grief. And I've been doing this work for many years and working with schools, and I was so grateful for what you outlined of the phases that the school went through. And you talked about the easy hard, the hard, and the hidden hard of how the school was like interfacing with the community and grief. Can you say more about those?
Yeah, and I'm so glad that they're proving to be useful to people. That's like the dream of an academic to, like do, deep work and, be able to tell stories, but then to like come up with something, some kind of like concept that can stick and that can help explain other phenomena. So, yeah, I hope that this is helpful because I've definitely seen it now in multiple iterations. So for me, the easy hard is the immediate day or days after a shared loss, and the kind of the time when a community, whether it's a school or another kind of community, comes together to grieve together. There's, a sense of recognition, of, accommodation, of acceptance that there's lots of different ways to express grief. In the case of the school, that day that we returned after Justin's death, that Monday, there was this really beautiful kind of leveling of the hierarchies of a school. The, teachers, administrators, students, like all are feeling this loss in similar ways and all kind of supporting each other. And the the fact that some people are adults and some people are kids like matters less than the fact that we're all kind of bearing this emotional weight together. So I call that the easy hard. And that phrase comes actually from the vice principal who kind of said it offhand on that Monday in the teacher's lounge. He said, he was like heating up his lunch and he said, today's the easy hard day, but tomorrow is going to be harder and it's going to keep getting so much harder. And he really foresaw that. So I call the next stage the hard, and that is the time when a school tries to return to normal, get back to business as usual. It's obvious to us that there's many people in a school building who aren't ready for that and, don't have the capacity, within a day or two to like be back to normal. And so this hard period creates tensions between the needs for emotional support and academic pressures. And in the case of boys prep created a lot of divisions and conflicts between staff and students and among staff and also among students to some degree. And that, in the case of this school lasted for a couple months. And then the kind of long term I call the hidden hard, which is the sort of period where things appear to be really back to normal. And yet so many people are still grieving, doing it alone mostly. The boys were mostly expressing their grief on social media, maybe once in a while in a one-on-one conversation with a friend or a teacher or me, and like I said, they're embodying their grief, on their bodies and on the walls of the school, but mostly out of view of the adults in school and also, in many cases, the adults at home. I argue that this hidden hard period is probably the long-term state for many students and probably for many schools, particularly those that experience a lot of gun violence in the neighborhood.
Well, and what I love about this way of seeing it, this concept, is it seems to mirror what so many folks experience just in their individual grief and then their families too. That first couple of days or weeks where you're surrounded by people and you're all in it together and you're in the sort of liminal space of the in between. And then there's the return to work, return to laundry, return to grocery shopping. And it's like, how do I do this? And then it goes on to the point where everyone's like, well, you're fine now, right? And then the grief becomes so internalized or so private. So I think it's really helpful, especially when I think about supporting schools, to just name that that's what's happening. Because I think a lot of people can find an experience in their own life of like, oh, right, I do remember that and how that goes. And that hard, not to be silly, but it's so hard because it really highlights how people individually want to or feel like you should attend to or orient towards grief. And then that conflict piece of thinking other people are doing it different and so they're maybe doing it wrong, or other people's wishes are infringing on what I need. It's a really tricky time, I think, for schools.
Yeah. I also heard and experienced too that like the kind of like long-term trajectory after COVID, we can use a similar model for, that like maybe even the whole first year was like the easy hard. I mean, it was very hard, but like we're all in this together. And then I think for many educators and students, I heard that the kind of like 2021, 2022 period was actually like maybe even harder because there was this expectation of being back to normal when it really didn't feel it. And then, all the kind of like lingering effects that we don't talk about now. Um, so yeah, I think like at the kind of micro scale and then at the macro scale, we can use it.
So, with all of the work with your amazing book, Brothers in Grief, all of the hours of interviews and conversations you had with students and educators, what do you think schools continue to need around responding to students and staff when a member of their school community dies?
I I love this question because it's so important, and I hate this question because it's so hard.
It's so
Um,
hard.
I struggled with this in how to write the last chapter of the book, and I think schools are already asked to do way more than they should need to do. I think it's very instructive that students opened up in their conversations with me, and that students who I haven't talked to in 5 years will DM me on Instagram and say, "Oh, I remember when we had that 45-minute interview." I mean, they don't remember that it was only 45 minutes, but they remember it as something that like really impacted them, and that's not because I'm like a teenage whisperer or like any, magical person. I think what I find instructive about it is just how few spaces and people they have, that are kind of like how few people they have who have the time and the capacity to be really curious about their grief and kind of like willing to sit with them with it, who also aren't there to help them. And I think that that's really key for teenagers and maybe particularly for boys and maybe for particularly for Black boys. So many mental health or grief supports are kind of framed as like fixing the kid or helping them. And I think kids are really resistant to that. They shouldn't be. They probably do need help, and they probably would get help from, these services, but they are resistant. And they have a right to be, suspicious or skeptical. But I think my presence, and, again, not as anyone like with any special skills necessarily, but my presence as someone who was there to be helped by them, to learn from them. Basically, my pitch was like, I'm writing a book. I'm a graduate student doing a project, writing a book. Can you help me learn about you? I want to understand your life and your experience. And some of them who had kind of resisted when they thought I was a therapist, all of a sudden were like, oh, of course I want to help you. Like, I have lots to tell you. So I feel like there's something there. And I'm actually like really in the process of trying to figure out how to articulate that better and be able to frame this for schools. But I think we need to have spaces in schools where students' agency is really valued, where we're kind of acknowledging the role that they can play in their communities and solving problems in their communities, rather than kind of framing it as they are a problem or they have a problem. And we need people in school buildings and in, spaces that serve young people who are not authority figures and, not evaluating them academically and not disciplining them, but who are really, there to be, mentors or to be just curious, supportive, available adults. I think there's lots of community spaces that have that, but I think schools don't generally have those people, or schools don't value those people and don't train those people in like grief sensitive or trauma informed approaches. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I could say, but I feel like that's kind of where my thinking is right now. That, I mean, schools need money. They need more like counselors and social workers and therapists. But maybe there's a kind of base of volunteers and a base of the adults who already exist in school buildings, like receptionists and janitors and security guards and coaches, like who are already doing this kind of work with young people who, need more support maybe to do that work well and to be the kind of landing spot for students who are grieving, who do want to talk. And then we need to create more spaces where we're kind of like acknowledging and honoring the power and the agency of young people.
So every school needs an ethnographer.
Right.
Sit down.
A permanent.
I don't have to, yeah.
No, I really don't mean to sound like I think like I did some amazing thing, but I think there was like this unexpected discovery from just like being able to be there for 2 years without a job, which like, I mean, whoever gets that amazing like gift and opportunity, I feel so lucky that I had it.
I think what really stands out, though, is that you weren't in a disciplinary role. You weren't in a fixing role. You were there just to be curious. And also, your curiosity invited them to provide a service. And the combination of those three things seems really powerful. Not just for grief, but particularly for grief, to feel like there's something I can do with this that will be helpful to somebody else. I get to choose how I engage with it, and there aren't going to be consequences for me taking this time and space to explore what I feel and think and how this has impacted me. One of my last questions to you is going to be about questions. And you already shared a little of like what your orientation was to having these conversations and interviews with students. Are there one or two questions that you found to be the most helpful or opening or invitational to students?
I experimented with a lot of different approaches over all the interviews, and in a few of them, I asked students to draw like timelines of their losses And in a few of the interviews, I asked them to kind of like map the sort of emotional trajectory of their high school, of their time in, I think, all of school. And some of those that, those were hit or miss, but sometimes they really like just giving them a pen and paper opened them up. And maybe also that created a little bit of quiet for them to think and not feel like they had to respond immediately. So I think that helped. I think asking them to tell stories, like asking them to, if we were talking about a particular loss, like asking them to walk me through finding out and like how they experienced, learning of the death and like the few days after. I think those kind of like open-ended questions were the most, that's what I remember. Like the stories that I remember the most were from those kinds of questions. And maybe those are kind of like the least leading questions. Because I had lots of like more specific questions, based on the like theories that I had. But I feel like the ones that just let them tell the story the way they wanted to maybe got us the furthest.
Yeah, to have an activity to do too, like
Yeah.
another way to maybe even just sit with their thoughts and expressions and have that reflected back to themselves when they do draw something out or map something out. I think there can be a lot of power in that.
Yeah. Oh, and the question, I would always ask the question at the end, like, what was this like for you? What, like, what was talking about this like? And inevitably, there'd be like another 15 minutes. Like, I would think we were done. And then that's where they would say, like, oh, I never get to talk about this. Or like, this felt more relieving than I expected. I thought this was going to be like therapy, and I, think therapy is dumb or whatever, but this felt different, or this makes me want to try therapy. Or, I mean, it's just a whole range of things that kind of came out when they were asked to reflect on what it was like to talk, for maybe 45 minutes about grief. Like to me, that's like not a big deal. We've just talked for 45 minutes about grief, you know. Um, but to some of them, that was like the longest time they'd ever spent talking about this.
Like it really highlighted how unusual it was for them to have that amount of space or time
Right.
to really delve into the grief and the reactions. So, Nora, originally when you were starting your research or starting to think about your research, you really wanted to explore the question of what is it like to live when you have a shortened expectation for your lifespan. And I know you didn't directly address that in your research, you looked at other questions, but I wonder what you took from the work you did around that question.
I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I guess, like I said earlier, I was surprised that I didn't hear that same kind of early death expectancy talk among Philadelphia teens that I got to know. And I don't know what to make of that difference kind of across these two contexts. But I think I definitely, I mean, whether they were saying it out loud or whether they were just kind of talking about the normalization and the numbness of so much loss. I think big picture, like a takeaway is just like how burdened young people are in their like their imaginings of the future are so weighed down by grief, by loss, by violence. For sure, there are some who find motivation in loss and find kind of inspiration to pursue their future plans. But I mean, there are so many obstacles. Kids, who have been schooled in this like unequal, unjust, under-resourced school system already face to, getting to college, graduating from college, pursuing a meaningful career that, will also like allow them to live comfortably. They're already facing so many obstacles to that. To compound it with, with this sort of drumbeat in their adolescence of loss is like it's just so much. I don't have a more eloquent way to say it. Even if they weren't saying out loud that they didn't expect to live very long, their idea of what a life looks like can't possibly be not marred by, by this set of experiences.
Bringing it back to the personal one last time, is there a way in which this work, these 2 years that you spent in such close contact with these boys and listening to their, experiences with grief, has it shifted how you think about your own grief?
I think doing this work and sharing it, starting to share it and hear people's reactions helps me continue to be reminded that grief doesn't have a timeline. I know this on lots of levels in grief communities like where you work, and like obviously it's like grief 101. There's no timeline for grief. But I think as a person navigating our society and our culture, which diminishes grief and expects us to find closure and move on, I'm finding myself just as susceptible to that in moments. And so I think talking about these boys and kind of advocating for their needs and the responses that I'm getting to that, I think in some ways helps me remember my own needs and, helps me remember that my own grief also doesn't have a timeline. Like becoming a mother has shifted my experience of the grief over my mom, but also kind of, I think this all just like gives me a little more space to just be with my own memories and my own grief and be more accepting of, the moments when it pops up, because the voice that's like, oh, it's, too late for that, or you need to focus on your work, or you can't, just like take the day off because you're feeling this random wave of grief. If I had heard the boys say that to themselves, I would be criticizing that. So I think it reminds me, most of the time to not apply that critical voice to myself too.
To recognize how the hidden heart is creeping in.
Yes, exactly.
And to maybe move away from the hidden part as much.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Nora, thank you so much for talking with me about this. And I imagine listeners now are going to want to, one, find your book, Brothers in Grief, and then just follow you to see kind of where your work and research goes next. So where would you lead or direct people to connect with you?
Sure. You can find my website, noragross.com. And the book also has a website, brothersinGrief.com. You can find each through each other. You can find the book wherever books are sold or at the library, hopefully. I'm on Blue Sky at Nora Gross. We were saying before, maybe LinkedIn feels like the new, or I was saying maybe LinkedIn feels like the new social media space. So I'm also there, I think just with my name. But I'm not on social media that much. Yeah, and on my website, I have some resources for educators and for readers of the book that I hope people find useful, and would love to be in touch if you make use of those resources, or if you read the book and want to talk.
Great. Well, listeners, I'll link to all of those. And I know sometimes when we hear like a book that's about a research study, you think, oh gosh, am I going to want to read that? But honestly, this book read more like a memoir, and I read it in one sitting. So I highly, highly recommend it. Nora, yeah, thank you for being so generous with both your personal grief and all of the stories that you carry from the boys and the students and the educators that you spent those 2 years talking with. I'm really thankful.
Thank you. Thanks for having me and creating such a safe space for us to talk.
And listeners, I say this each and every single time, but thank you for making the show mean something, for sharing episodes with people who might be helped in some way by what we're talking about here. If you want to reach out to me directly, you can email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. That's also our main website. And if you head there, you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. And if you're somebody out there who's looking to learn more about grief and how to support people who are grieving, we also have a series of online classes that you can take at your own pace. So if you head to the website, you can learn more about those. I'm always excited to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Grief Out Loud is a production of Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.